Hi guys, welcome back or welcome to Switch to Life, and today we're going to be reviewing Despicable Me 3. Now, I really enjoyed this movie, but I do hate to say it, this is by far the worst installment out of the entire Despicable Me franchise. And yes, I'm including all 6 movies, including Despicable Me 4, even though that one's not even out yet. Now, I'm just gonna say it, I love this movie. The animation was actually really awesome, especially when compared to the first 2 films. Not to mention the music, it was really good, but still a bit of a step down from the second movie. And then there's also the voice acting, which I will admit was a definite upgrade in this entire thing because Steve Carell does an amazing job voicing Gru and another character, Drew, his twin brother. Which brings me to another point. The story of this movie isn't that good. In fact, it was all over the place. There's like 5 different stories going on in this movie, and while some of them do end up tying together, there's a few that don't really have any place in the overall story. Which brings me up another point, the pacing. Honestly, I hated the pacing of this movie. There was so much going on in such little screen time that it's like really sad how much they dedicated to one plot versus another, and some are fleshed out, some are not. So with that in mind, let's dive into the story. So the main villain of this movie is Balthazar Brat, a kid actor from the 1980s TV show Evil Brat, where he would play a kid supervillain who would take over the world. And the show lasted 2 seasons until Balthazar hit puberty, making it so that the show was canceled for season 3. Balthazar grew angry at Hollywood and decided to seek revenge by actually becoming the kid villain that he was portraying. And now, roughly 30-40 years later, he's a grown man and he's still acting like that kid villain, and now Gru and Agent Lucy are sent to take him down, and he manages to escape, but his plan is thwarted when Gru takes the world's largest diamond away from him. And it's at this point that Silas Ramsbottom reveals that he's about to retire and a brand new agent is going to take over as head of the Anti-Villain League, and the first thing that she does is fire Gru for not getting Balthazar Brat. And even though Gru managed to stop Balthazar's plan, he was still fired for not capturing the bad guy. At which point, Lucy stands up to defend Gru, and I do love that. It shows how much loyalty that Lucy has to her new husband.
If you fire him, you're gonna have to fire me, sister. And do you really want to do that? No. Well, I guess she did.
And now, without a job, the minions actually try to convince Gru that they should go back to being villains, but when that doesn't work, Mel decides to lead the rest of the minions in quitting working for Gru. Now that Gru was no longer the biggest, baddest villain around, there's no reason for the minions to continue serving him. So they quit, at which point they go off on their own adventure, and it's really stupid because I do not like that the minions got their own plot in this movie. They end up going to a singing competition where they are thrown in prison for breaking and entering, and then they realize that they actually miss Gru, and they break out of prison and then head over to help Gru, at which point they show up in the final battle and do absolutely nothing. I really do not like the minions in this movie. Not only were their scenes not very funny, but they were also time consuming. They took away valuable screen time that could have been used for the rest of the movie, and instead they just dedicated those screen time to a bunch of scenes that were completely unnecessary and had 0 point in the overall story. And at the same time, Kevin, Bob, and Stuart from the Minions movie, which was the movie released before this one, don't even show up at all, which is weird because they show up in Despicable Me 2. Kevin and Stuart literally have main roles in that movie, but they're nowhere to be seen here, which is really disappointing. This was the first time where I actually started to hate the minions, and it's really understandable why. They're the worst part of this movie. However, there are other bad parts, including the villain himself. He's not really that memorable when compared to the funniness of Vector or the powerfulness of El Macho. He's literally just there. He doesn't add much to the overall story, despite the fact that he is the main antagonist. So let's go back to him. He ends up sneaking into the museum where the world's largest diamond is being held, and he takes it, at which point Gru sees that in the newspaper and is devastated. And then he discovers that Agnes is actually selling her stuff so that the family can help stay afloat. And the thing is, Gru actually is happy that Agnes is maturing, but at the same time, he's devastated that he's failing as a parent, because if his daughter feels like she needs to sell her stuff to help them stay alive, then he's really doing a bad job. And that is when an old guy named Fritz shows up, and it turns out that he's actually a butler who works for someone, and he reveals that Gru has a long-lost twin brother. So Gru talks with his mom about this, at which point Marlena reveals the fact that it's actually true. Gru did have a long-lost twin brother, and shortly after he and Drew were born, their parents divorced and they each took one son.
And promised never to see each other again. Obviously, I got second pick.
And then they end up going to Fredonia, where they end up meeting Drew, who is essentially a richer, better version of Gru.
All right, let's go home now.
Home? Why?
I don't know, this guy with the mansion and the cars and all of the hair with the silky smooth, luxurious hair. I feel worse than I did before I came.
And they also learn that the family business is pig farming, and then Drew ends up suggesting that the girls and Lucy should go explore Fredonia, and when they do, Drew ends up taking Gru aside and introduces him to the real family business, super villainy.
C'est Gru con boobs.
Yeah, it turns out that Gru's father was the Bald Terror, a former criminal mastermind who, again, was descended from a long line of villainy, and he was actually really proud of the villain that Gru became. Drew, not so much. Drew wants to be a really good supervillain, but he doesn't seem to have any skills. And then when Gru shows up, he tries to convince Gru to help train him to be a supervillain, at which point Gru, who gave up being a supervillain, says no, they should not do that. But then Drew ends up showing off some really cool supervillain gadgets, and Gru gets back in the game having a lot of fun, and for some inexplicable reason, I find it extremely weird that not once do they ever acknowledge the fact that Gru wants to go back to villainy. He is a family man, and he wants to be a good person. But the thing is, he has no job at the AVL, he's good at being a supervillain, and he also happens to be descended from a long line of villainy. He enjoys being a villain, but not once does he ever consider actually trying to go back to villainy. Sure, he's tempted, but he never once considers it. I think that the movie would have been way better if they actually tried to make it so Gru actually considered going back to villainy, but then eventually he goes back to his family and realizes he's making a mistake. But no, they never did that. I guess that shows how much of a family man that Gru is, but at the same time, it took away a lot from making this movie better. But Drew still wants to actually be a super villain, so he tries to pull off a heist with his brother, at which point Gru reveals that there is one heist that he wants to do, stealing the world's largest diamond from Balthazar Brat, who stole it from the museum. And if they steal the diamond, it's possible that Gru and Lucy can get their jobs at the AVL back. So Gru ends up tricking his brother Drew into thinking that they're actually pulling off a villain heist, when in actuality they're pulling off a good guy heist. And while all that's going on, Lucy and the girls are bonding in Fredonia, where Margot actually ends up eating a bite of cheese from a little boy, and we'll get back into that later. But at the same time, Agnes and Edith walk into a bar where they end up meeting a strange guy who says that he saw a real-life unicorn.
Was it fluffy?
It was so fluffy! I thought I was gonna die.
And that they're in the forest, and says that if a maiden pure of heart shows up in the forest, the unicorn will approach the girl and be hers forever. And obviously Agnes, who loves unicorns, it's like her defining trait, decides to get a good night's rest so that the next day she can go into the forest and find a unicorn. And while all that's happening, Edith is up to her mischievous pranks against Fritz. And then Lucy ends up trying to convince Margot to, again, eat a bite of cheese from a little boy's plate, who is sad. And it turns out that in Fredonia, that's actually a marriage proposal custom. So it turns out that officially, Margot and the little boy are supposed to be married. And when Margot and Lucy end up refusing this, saying that there's a misunderstanding, the little boy's mother comes up and tries to insult Margot and her family.
You refuse my son's engagement, pig?
What?
May you and your daughter die a slow death and be buried with onions.
At which point Lucy steps up and defends the Margot and the family honor. And this whole time, Lucy has been trying to get the girls to see her as a mother, which at the end of the second movie they do, but for some reason in this movie, Lucy doesn't really feel like it, especially when Margot says that she hates her. And then once Lucy defends Margot's honor, she ends up actually saying that she's proud to have Lucy as a mother. And then Lucy sees that Gru and Drew are sneaking out, at which point Gru and Drew break into Balthazar's fortress. And I just want to point out something really quick. How is it that Gru knows how to use these villain gadgets that Drew has? Because Gru has spent his whole life being a super villain, so he knows how to use gadgets in the right situations. But the issue is that when it comes to these gadgets, they're not invented by Dr. Nefario, so how does he know how to use them? What's their capabilities? How does he know all that? And then Drew, who grew up with these super spy gadgets his whole life, doesn't even know how to use the basic functions, which is really stupid. But anyway, the heist goes off with minor problems, mostly coming from Drew's incompetence, but despite all that, Gru ends up managing to take the diamond from Balthazar, and when they try to escape, they're almost caught, except Lucy shows up in the getaway helicopter, and they end up getting away. When they get home, Lucy is happy that Gru actually did something behind her back to try to get their jobs at the AVL back, and then it's revealed that, well, Gru was lying to Drew, and Drew is extremely upset, and the brothers have a bit of a falling out. And then it's revealed that Agnes and Edith went into the woods to find a unicorn, and they brought back a one-horned goat, which Agnes thinks is a real unicorn and ends up naming Lucky, and she brings it home with her.
Yeah, I'll let someone else burst her bubble.
But then when she shows it off to Gru, Gru gives the unfortunate news that Lucky is in fact a goat. And while Agnes was hoping for a unicorn, she got a goat. And sometimes life is like that. But Agnes turns it around and says that Lucky is the best goat in the world. And when Gru is talking about that, he's actually talking about how he had high hopes for a twin brother and he's disappointed with Drew. But then he realizes that even though Drew has his flaws, he might actually be the best brother that Gru could ever ask for. especially when Balthazar Brat actually sneaks into the mansion, takes the diamond, and ends up kidnapping the girls, forcing Gru, Drew, and Lucy to launch a rescue mission to Hollywood, where Balthazar enacts his evil plan, which was to build a giant robot version of himself and use a deadly laser and some helium-employed bubblegums to send Hollywood up into space, just like he did in one episode of the Evil Brat TV show. Then, while Lucy goes and rescues the girls, Gru and Drew end up fighting against the giant evil robot, and while Gru happens to get injured in the fight, Drew ends up going inside the robot and tries to dismantle it from the inside, and when he succeeds, he ends up getting injured in the process, at which point Gru wakes up and has a final confrontation with Balthazar Brat, which turns out to be a dance fight, just like what happened at the start of the movie. And then during the dance fight, Gru actually steals Balthazar's keytar and uses it against him to officially defeat Balthazar Brat. And then when Gru tries to check on Drew is actually okay. And then the minions show up and everybody returns home to Gru's house in California, Drew included, at which point Drew and the minions end up working together to steal a bunch of Gru's villain stuff, and Drew sets out on his path to actually become a real supervillain. And Gru and Lucy are AVL agents, so they have to go get him.
Oh, let's get him.
Oh, honey, he's my brother! We'll give him a 5-minute head start.
Now, I hate to say it, but I both love and hate this movie. It was a good time watching it, but at the same time, it's the single worst film of the entire Despicable Me franchise. And that's actually universally agreed upon for the most part. And while I do think that it has its ups, like how we actually have Gru and Drew, who are twin brothers, one of them is a supremely competent supervillain, but doesn't have the desire to be one. One of them wants to be a supervillain, but they don't have the skill set. And they both love each other and want them to actually do their goals, but at the same time, they're on opposite sides of the battle, so it's really weird. But there's also a lot of great potential with that storyline to be told in a possible sequel, which unfortunately does not seem to be the case with Despicable Me 4, as we've yet to see anything regarding Drew. And then there's the fact that Gru and the girls, who had a really awesome dynamic in the first two movies, don't really have much going on in this one. Sure, we see Gru bonding with Agnes over when she sells her unicorn stuff, and at the same time trying to deter her from going into the forest to look for unicorns.
Unicorns don't really explore that part of the woods.
Only for her to bring home a goat and help her cope with the fact that sometimes there are disappointments in life. And we see that Agnes actually matures, but there's not much going on with Gru and the girls. They're not a driving focus in this, which kind of makes sense since Gru is trying to both take down Balthazar Brat and bond with his twin brother. There's a lot going on for Gru in this movie. So I like that there's actually some aspect of Lucy trying to learn to be a good mother, but at the same time, the kids already saw her as a mother, so it's really weird. And what's even weirder is the fact that even though it's been 3 movies now, and they're coming out with the 4th, the girls still haven't aged up, like, at all.
Oh, you are so mature. I'm guessing, what, you 15?
15?
She's 12. She looks 12 and will always be 12.
And then, of course, the minions, who don't really do anything in this movie except take up valuable screen time. That's it. So, I think that Despicable Me 3 is good and worth a few laughs, but at the same time, it's the worst film of the entire Despicable Me franchise. And that's saying something, as Despicable Me 4 hasn't even been released yet. But I still have high hopes for it, and I don't think it can be much worse than what Despicable Me 3 gave us. In fact, I think it will be better. But with that in mind, I hope that you guys enjoyed my review. Please make sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up to date on all things DreamWorks. And also, when Despicable Me 4 launches in theaters this Wednesday, I will be posting my review next week on Friday. With that in mind, I hope that you're all staying safe out there, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye-bye.
Oh, we're getting...
Along perfectly.
Wait, did we just finish each other's sentences?
Oh, that's delightful. Not creepy at all. And you're gonna stop now, though, right?
Sorry, it's a twin thing.
Uh-huh.